What's up guys, TechLab here. Now in today's video we're going to be catching up with a graphics card that doesn't really need any kind of real introduction. This is the Nvidia Geforce GTX 1060 6GB. It was released by Nvidia many moons ago, and for the longest time it was the budget gamer's dream. But can you still actually game on one, and what kind of experience can you get? Well, today that's what we're going to find out. So a lot of you out there would actually consider the Nvidia GeForce 10 series as being Nvidia's best generation ever. They produced a whole lineup of cards that offered some fantastic performance at really good prices, something that we don't generally tend to see nowadays. We've either got really high performance and high prices, or really low performance and low prices. But back in the 10 series, cards like this actually kind of defined a whole generation, and there was good reason for it, because these cards were not that expensive and they actually offered the previous generation's flagship kind of performance, comparing this to like the 980 and the 980 Ti. And for a budget gamer that was actually buying its 60 class kind of cards, that was fantastic for you, because you were suddenly going from something like the GTX 960 all the way up to the 980 Ti by just buying the budget card from the next generation. These cards were actually so popular, they held the top position on the Steam Hardware survey for many years actually. They were only really overtaken by the RTX 3060 several years later, but they still actually hold quite a high position now, which goes to show that many people are actually still using them. On paper, they were actually pretty decent. They were part of the Pascal architecture. The standard model had a base clock speed of 1506 MHz, a boost clock speed of 1709 MHz. It came with 1280 shaders, as well as 6GB of GDDR5, which was pretty impressive for the time and the tier of card. It had a memory bus of 192 bits with a PCI Gen 3x16 interface, and they only used around 120 watts. They were originally released at only $299, which seems impossible nowadays, because you're really talking about low-level cards for that kind of price. And of course, they were released in 2016, which kind of makes them roughly around 9 years old now. So can a 9-year-old graphics card actually still pull its weight? Well, to be honest, they're actually pretty good. The exact model that I managed to pick up recently was this one here. It is the Asus ROG Strix Gaming OC, so it offers a little bit more performance over the standard model, and to be honest, it offers you a lot more in kind of build quality here. It does offer the triple fan configuration here with RGB lighting that actually goes all the way around the sides. Many people would say that this is actually very well over-engineered, and I can kind of agree with them, to be honest, because most GTX 1060s that I've had in the past, and I've had a few of them but just not one for a while, they've been very short cards, because you don't really need a lot in there. It also comes with a very nice kind of side panel in here where they hide any kind of heat pipes and things like that, and there's also a slight little bit of RGB through the logo here, and a pretty decent backplate which is made of aluminium, so it should help with the conductivity. But overall, I'm actually super impressed with this graphics card. I don't tend to get Asus ROG Strix things because they're so expensive, and I'm sure at the time this would have cost an absolute fortune, but maybe it was actually worth it, because this thing is silent, it stays really cool, and if you vertically mount it in your system, it looks really good too. So for the time, they offered a pretty decent price to performance, particularly on paper. They were extremely popular, and if you could get yourself a model just like this one, they pretty much last forever as well. But how well do they actually perform today when you pit them against some of the latest and greatest titles? Well, it's a little bit touch and go, because this card doesn't offer things like hardware ray tracing or anything like mesh shaders that are required for games like Alan Wake 2. You're going to have a pretty rough performance, even if the game will actually start. Games like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, you're clearly not going to be able to play on one of these, not unless you're using something like Linux and you can bypass that stuff. Games like Doom, The Dark Ages, again, is another one that's not going to run on it. And even though Alan Wake 2 will actually start on a graphics card like this, the performance is so dire, it's absolutely not worth it. You're going to have to drop the resolution all the way down to something like 720p. And even then, it's going to look really bad, and it's still going to perform really bad. But there are still thousands of games out there that come that don't require any of that stuff. So we've put this card against a bunch of those titles just to see how well it performs, and see if it really does give the ultra budget gamer today an option worth going for. And I think you'll find that the results are pretty surprising. So as you can see from those benchmarks, the GTX 1060 6GB actually still puts up a fight in 2025. This graphics card can still get around 60 FPS plus in most of the titles that we tested, although it did take a little bit of help from AMD actually, using AMD's FSR technology. There is no DLSS on these, so you're not going to get any help from Nvidia, but you can get some help from AMD's FSR, and just tweaking things here and there, you can get a pretty decent performance. You can play games like Black Myth Wukong, which is pretty impressive to be fair, because I didn't think this graphics card was even going to start that game. Of course, games like Doom Eternal are going to get very high FPS performance. They always do on things like that. So for older games, it is still perfectly viable. And for newer games, you can pretty much push it there if you use enough of configuration and things like that in the settings. That actually makes this a pretty decent buy, particularly when you can purchase them nowadays for under £50. For a while, they were sitting around the £60 to £80 level, which is generally where you can kind of find things like the RX 580, although they are dropping too. They kind of fluctuates a lot. But I managed to pick this card up locally for only £45. So for £45, I managed to get a decent model with a box as well, because mine did come with the full box and everything inside of it. It's a very clean model. It's never been opened up, so it could probably do with a little bit of a repaste, but during my testing, I had absolutely no issues at all. Asus actually did a pretty decent job on this one, and I'm sure they probably do on most Asus ROG Strix because they are their highest end stuff. But yeah, for £45 you can get a graphics card to drop in a system that doesn't tend to care about what PCI generation you're using. You can pretty much pair it up with a reasonably low system. We recently did with the Ryzen 5 3600. They're pretty cheap nowadays and it performed exceptionally well with that. You can even go as low as something like an Intel 9th generation or even a 2nd generation Ryzen, and this card will still actually perform really well as well. Of course, we tested it today in our bench rig, which has the AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D. It's not a typical pairing that you would give with this card. Of course, you do not want to be spending over £400 on a CPU to game on a £45 graphics card, so don't do that. But if you do pair it with a pretty decent system, one that is more aligned to this graphics card, you're going to get a pretty decent performance and a great gaming experience too. So there we go. That is the GTX 1060 6GB. I probably wouldn't even try the 3GB version because they do come in 3GB. Probably not this model here, but I have had little tiny cards in the past that do have 3GB of VRAM on it. 3GB is really pushing the boat nowadays. Even 6GB is pushing the boat on most of those games. As soon as you start putting things into high textures and things like that, it completely falls over. So you do need to tweak that kind of stuff. But yeah, GTX 1060 in 2025 still games perfectly fine and does make a viable option for those of you on an ultra tight budget. Anyway, that is our catch up, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content. Also, let me know in the comments below, do you still use a GTX 1060 6GB or do you have one sitting in a drawer somewhere? Lots of people kept these around just in case there was a new GPU apocalypse and they needed something as a spare, so they would actually make a fantastic spare graphics card if you are somebody that does that. And I'm sure as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one.